In the shadow of his very famous brother Al, there lived a man whose story has been talked about in whispers in the dark corners of Chicago's criminal world. Ralph Bottles Capone, a name that brought both respect and fear, but always stayed in the dark shadow of the legend of Scarface himself. But what if I told you that Ralph's story might have been more interesting, more complicated, and definitely more heartbreaking than the brother who towered over him? Before we jump into this unknown chapter of the Prohibition time in Chicago, I want to find out where in the world you are listening from tonight. Write your city and the current time down in the comments down below. Are you relaxing after a long day in New York? Maybe it's early morning in London, or maybe you're somewhere in the middle, letting this story drift you off into a peaceful sleep. If you like these deep dive stories about gangsters that help you relax and calm down, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Give this video a thumbs up. If you're ready for a trip through the smoky streets of Chicago in the 1920s, don't forget to share this with anyone who likes the unknown stories of America's most famous era. Let's travel back in time. The year was 1899, and the tight apartment buildings of Brooklyn were filled with the sounds of many different languages, the calls of people selling things on the street, and the dreams of newcomers who had crossed an ocean hoping for a chance at a better life. In one of those crowded apartments on Navy Street, Gabrielle and Teresa Capone welcomed their second son into the world. They called him Raphael, though the American way of speaking would soon change it into Ralph. The Capone home was full of organized chaos. Gabrielle worked cutting hair, his rough hands steady with a razor, even though he had the heavy job of taking care of a growing family. Teresa, only 25 years old, handled the impossible task of feeding 8 kids on the money a barber made. The apartment always smelled like garlic, tomatoes, and the strong soap they used to scrub their few pieces of clothing clean. Ralph was born just 2 years after his brother Alonzo. Al, as everyone called him, but even when they were little kids, the differences between them were easy to see. Where Al was loud, demanding attention with his fists and his voice, Ralph watched and waited. While Al fought the neighborhood boys for land and power, Ralph paid attention, learning how power worked, understanding without being taught that sometimes the quiet voice meant more than the loudest shout. The walls of the apartment building were thin, and the Capone kids learned early that having privacy was a luxury they could not afford. Ralph shared a bed with Al and their younger brother Frank, 3 bodies squished together on a mattress that had seen better days even before it came to their apartment. In those early morning hours before the sun came up, when Brooklyn was at its most quiet, Ralph would listen to his brother's breathing and make plans. Even as a young boy, Ralph had something his brothers and sisters did not have. He was good with numbers and had a natural feel for business. While other kids his age were playing stickball in the streets, Ralph was figuring out how much profit the candy store on the corner was making. He watched how Mr. Torio, the neighborhood businessman who ran gambling games, handled his territory using a mix of friendliness and quiet threats. The neighborhood itself was a mix of different immigrant groups and chances for work. Irish men who worked on the docks drank next to Italian men who worked with stone, while Jewish store owners sold things to anyone who had money to pay. It was here that Ralph first understood that America's promise was not just about working hard. It was about understanding how things worked, finding the spaces where nobody was paying attention, and putting yourself in a place to take advantage of both sides. School was something the Capone boys had to do, even though none of them really cared much about learning from books. Ralph stayed in school longer than Al, who got kicked out in 6th grade for hitting a teacher. But the education Ralph got came more from the streets than from classrooms. He learned math by helping local shop owners keep track of their money, learning skills that would help him much more than any lesson he could have learned in school. The big change happened in 1909 when Ralph was 10 years old. Al had already made a name for himself as the family's tough guy, quick with his fists and quick to get angry. But it was Ralph who noticed that their neighbor, Mrs. Colombo, was getting cheated by the grocery delivery boy. Instead of confronting the kid directly, which is what Al would have done, Ralph quietly kept track of the stealing. Then he went to Mrs. Colombo with an offer. "I can make sure you get what you pay for," Ralph told her, his young voice steady. "Just give me 5 cents every week, and I will watch your deliveries," Mrs. Colombo agreed. And word spread quickly through the apartment building. Within a month, Ralph was running a small protection service for older neighbors, making sure they got everything they paid for and did not get overcharged. It was his first taste of organized business, and the money he made, almost $2 a week, was more than some grown men earned. Gabriel noticed his son's business mind with a mix of pride and worry. One evening, as Ralph was counting his money at the kitchen table, his father sat down next to him. "Raphael," Gabriel said in his heavy Italian accent, "you have a good head for business, but remember, in America, there are 2 kinds of business. The kind that builds respect, and the kind that brings trouble. Always choose respect," Ralph nodded. But even at 10 years old, he understood that the line between those 2 kinds of business was not as clear as his father believed. In their neighborhood, respect often needed a little bit of fear, and the most successful men seemed to move easily between legal work and something darker. As the boys got older, the differences between them became even clearer. Al got kicked out of school for good when he was 14 and started working at a pool hall, where his quick temper and even quicker fists gave him a reputation. Frank, who was 2 years younger than Ralph, followed Al's example, drawn to the fast rewards of getting respect on the streets. Ralph, on the other hand, found work at a legal bottling plant, learning all about how to make things, deliver them, and manage the supply chain. The work was honest, but Ralph's mind was always figuring things out. How much profit was lost because things were not done efficiently? How the business could grow, where the weak spots were? His bosses noticed his smart thinking and promoted him quickly. But Ralph knew that legal business would never give his family enough money to escape the crowded apartments. The neighborhood was changing too. The old Italian families who had already made a place for themselves were being challenged by newer people coming in. And the fight for territory, whether for running gambling, selling protection, or controlling the docks, was getting more intense. Ralph watched it all, paying close attention like a chess player studying the board. It was during this time that Ralph first met Johnny Torio, the man who would change the direction of the Capone brothers' lives forever. Torio was everything Ralph admired. He was quiet, smart, and successful. He dressed well without being too flashy, commanded respect without raising his voice, and seemed to run legal businesses that somehow made much more money than you would expect from looking at how many customers they had. Ralph started spending time at Torio's places, not as a customer, but as someone watching and learning. He studied how Torio managed his workers, how he settled arguments, how he kept good relationships with both legal businessmen and people who were not so legal. Where Al saw Torio's success and wanted to copy his power, Ralph saw the systems behind that power and wanted to understand them. The chance came in 1915, when Ralph was 16. Torio needed someone to help manage the books for his different businesses. Someone he could trust, someone who was smart enough to keep multiple sets of records. Ralph had been helping local businesses with their accounting for 2 years, building a reputation for being accurate and keeping things secret. Your brother Al, Torio told Ralph during their first meeting. He's got fire, but fire without control burns everything down. You've got something different. You've got the mind for this business. Ralph took the job, and with it got his first real education in organized crime. Torio's operation was much more advanced than Ralph had ever imagined. There were legal businesses, restaurants, bakeries, barber shops that made real money and provided cover for other activities. There were protection services that made sure store owners could work safely in a city that was getting more dangerous. And there were businesses that existed in the gray areas of the law, taking advantage of people's desires for things that were not allowed and the authorities' inability to stop them completely. Under Torio's teaching, Ralph learned that successful organized crime was not really about violence. It was about being organized. Violence was a tool to be used carefully and only when it was really needed. The real power came from understanding how systems worked, building relationships, and making yourself so important that both legal and illegal businesses needed you. Al, meanwhile, had found his own way into Torio's organization, working his muscle and building a reputation for being both good at his job and willing to be violent. The brothers worked in different areas, Al on the streets, Ralph in the office. But their skills combined made them more and more valuable to Torio. The family situation changed as the brothers' illegal income grew. They were able to move the family to a better apartment, make sure their younger brothers and sisters stayed in school longer, and give their parents nice things that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Teresa Capone did not ask too many questions about where the money came from, but Gabriel watched his older sons with growing worry. "I came to America so my children could be better than what I was," he told Ralph one evening. "But what if better means something different than I thought?" Ralph understood his father's worry, but he also understood something his father did not. That in America, being considered legal and respectable was often just a matter of time and success. The rich families that controlled legal businesses had their own dark histories, their own moments of doing the wrong thing. The difference was that they had reached a level where society chose to forget where they came from. By 1918, Ralph had become essential to Torio's operation. He managed the money for over a dozen businesses, kept up relationships with suppliers and customers, and had built a network of contacts that stretched across both legal and illegal businesses. His reputation for being reliable and keeping secrets had spread throughout Brooklyn's organized crime community, and other families had started coming to him for advice about money. It was during this time that Ralph got his nickname Bottles. The name came from his legal work in the bottling industry, but it had a deeper meaning. Just like bottles hold and control what is inside them, Ralph held and controlled information, money, and opportunities. He was the container that held Torio's empire together, making sure nothing leaked out that should not, and that everything flowed in the right direction. The nickname also showed Ralph's understanding that in organized crime, how things looked mattered just as much as how they really were. Bottles suggested legal business, honest work, being respectable. It was a perfect cover for a man who was becoming one of New York's most skilled criminal accountants. Al's nickname came later, Scarface, after a fight in a bar left permanent marks across his cheek. The difference between the brothers' reputations told you everything. Al's scar showed he was willing to use violence, to face danger head-on. Ralph's Bottles suggested holding things in, being in control, waiting patiently. As 1920 got closer, Both brothers could feel that change was coming. The country was tired of fights in Europe, and politicians were promising things would go back to normal. But there were other changes coming. Changes that would create chances like nothing America had ever seen before. The Volstead Act was about to become law, and with it came the banning of alcohol. Most Americans saw this as a win for doing the right thing, a step toward a cleaner, more moral society. But Ralph saw it differently. He saw the biggest business opportunity in American history, a chance to build an empire by providing something that millions of people wanted but could not get legally. Johnny Torio saw it too, and he had plans that went way beyond Brooklyn. Chicago was becoming the center of American industry, a city where immigrant communities provided both cover and customers, where corruption in politics was already well established, and where the location made it perfect for sending products all over the Midwest. Ralph, Torio told him in late 1919, "I'm thinking about expanding my operations. Chicago has everything we need. Politicians we can work with, police who understand business, and a population that is not going to let some law tell them they cannot have a drink. What do you think?" Ralph had been studying Chicago for months, looking at census numbers, transportation networks, and political structures. His conclusion was clear. "It's perfect," he said, "but we will need to be smarter than anyone has ever been. Prohibition is not just going to create opportunity, it is going to create competition. Every ambitious crew from New York to San Francisco is going to want a piece of Chicago. We will need to be there first. We will need to be better organized. And we will need to be ready for a war." Torio smiled. "That is exactly what I was thinking. And I am going to need someone I can trust to handle the business side while I manage the politics. Someone who understands that this is not just about selling liquor. This is about building an organization that can control an entire industry." Ralph understood this was his moment, the chance to step out from behind the scenes and help build something that had never been done before. But it would also mean leaving New York, leaving the familiar neighborhoods and established relationships that had shaped his young life. More importantly, it would mean working closely with Al in a way they never had before. In New York, they had worked in different parts of Torio's organization. In Chicago, they would need to work as a team, combining Ralph's business sense with Al's street reputation and Torio's political connections. As 1920 began, Ralph made his decision. He would follow Torio to Chicago, bringing with him everything he had learned about organization, money, and the delicate art of working in the shadows of legal society. He did not know that he was about to become one of the builders of the most advanced criminal operation America had ever seen. What he did know was that Prohibition meant more than just a business opportunity. It was a chance to build something that would last, something that would lift the Capone name from the crowded apartments of Brooklyn to the heights of American power. It was a chance to prove that the quiet brother, the one who worked with numbers instead of guns, could be just as important as the one who made the headlines. The train to Chicago left on a cold February morning in 1920. Ralph carried 2 suitcases, one with his clothes and personal things, the other with carefully organized financial records and contact information for suppliers, politicians, and business partners he had built up over 5 years working for Torio. As the train pulled out of Pennsylvania Station, Ralph looked back at the city that had made him, then forward toward the city where he would help build an empire. He did not know that he was starting a journey that would make him one of the most powerful men in America, and, in the end, one of its most tragic figures. But he understood that he was leaving behind the safety of being a small player in someone else's game. In Chicago, he would help write the rules for an entirely new kind of business, one that would define an era and destroy anyone who could not adjust to its harsh demands. The wheels of the train clicked against the tracks, marking time and distance as Ralph Capone headed west toward his future. Behind him lay the certainty of childhood and learning the trade. Ahead lay the uncertainty of building an empire and the terrible price that power demands from those who try to use it. Chicago in 1920 was a city of opposites, and Ralph Capone understood opposites. As his train pulled into Union Station on that cold February morning, he could smell the future in the air, a mix of coal smoke from the steel factories, yeast from the breweries that were still legal, and the sweat of ambition from thousands of immigrants who had come to build new lives in America's fastest-growing city. The city spread out before him like a giant chessboard with neighborhoods clearly divided by race, social class, and opportunity. The Irish controlled the police and much of the political machinery. The Italians were making names for themselves in construction and legal business. The Jews dominated certain parts of commerce, and into this carefully balanced system, Prohibition was about to bring chaos and opportunity. Johnny Torio had arrived 6 months earlier, setting up a base of operations in the Levee District, Chicago's traditional area for vice. When Ralph joined him, Torio's operation was still pretty small. A few places to buy illegal alcohol, some gambling, the usual protection services. But Torio's vision went far beyond traditional organized crime. Ralph, Torio explained during their first meeting in Chicago, held in the back room of a legal restaurant that served as cover for planning sessions. What we are about to build has never existed before. We are not just going to sell liquor. We are going to control an entire industry. Production, transportation, distribution, stores, protection. We are going to build something that looks like a business and operates like a government. Ralph had spent the train ride west studying Chicago's population patterns, transportation networks, and political structure. His research confirmed Torio's instincts. The location is perfect, he told Torio. We have Lake Michigan for transportation from Canada, railroad connections to every major city in the Midwest, and a political system that is already comfortable with negotiation instead of enforcement. More importantly, Ralph had identified the critical weakness in Chicago's existing criminal structure. The various gangs, Irish, Italian, Jewish, and others, worked independently, often fighting with each other. They were focused on controlling territory rather than controlling an industry. Prohibition would create opportunities that went beyond territorial boundaries. But taking advantage of those opportunities would require coordination and organization that none of the existing gangs had. We need to think bigger than anyone else is thinking, Ralph continued. Every other organization is getting ready for Prohibition like it is going to be. A bigger version of what they are already doing. But this is going to be completely different. The demand will be huge, steady, and nationwide. The profits will be enormous, but so will the risks. We need to build something that can handle both. Torio nodded. That is why I need you handling the business side. Al is going to manage enforcement and territory. I am going to handle politics and outside relationships. But you are going to build the machine that makes it all work. Ralph's first challenge was setting up legal businesses that could serve as fronts for illegal operations. This required more than just buying existing businesses. It required understanding how legal industries actually worked, finding gaps in the market, and creating businesses that could make real money while providing cover for other activities. His background in the bottling industry proved extremely useful. Ralph understood production processes, supply chains, quality control, and distribution networks. More importantly, He understood that in the liquor business, controlling the containers was almost as important as controlling what was inside them. Ralph started by buying a small bottling plant on Chicago's South Side, using money that Torio had collected through traditional criminal activities. The plant was legal. It produced soda water, ginger ale, and other non-alcoholic drinks for local restaurants and illegal bars. But Ralph designed it with future needs in mind. The production lines could be quickly changed to handle different types of products. The storage areas were larger than current demand required. The loading docks were positioned to allow private access from multiple directions. Most importantly, Ralph hired workers based not just on their production skills, but on whether they could keep secrets and stay loyal. Within 6 months, Ralph had built a network of connected businesses. The bottling plant provided cover and actual production ability. A trucking company, supposedly created to deliver legal drinks, set up the transportation network that would later move illegal alcohol. A restaurant supply business created relationships with illegal bar owners throughout the city. Each business made money on its own, but together they formed the foundation for an illegal empire. The beauty of Ralph's approach was that it could grow. Unlike traditional criminal operations that depended on controlling specific territories, Ralph's system could expand across geographic boundaries. An illegal bar owner in Milwaukee could buy supplies through the same network that served places in Chicago. Detroit or St. Louis, the bottling plant could produce containers for operations throughout the Midwest. The trucking company could deliver products anywhere the railroads could reach. As Prohibition took effect on January 16, 1920, Ralph's preparations proved wise. While other criminal organizations scrambled to find supply sources and set up distribution networks, the Capone Torio operation was ready. They had products, containers, transportation, and customers. More importantly, they had systems in place to handle the complications of running a large-scale illegal business. The first year of Prohibition exceeded even Ralph's most hopeful predictions. The demand for illegal alcohol was huge and steady. Customers were willing to pay top prices for quality products delivered reliably. Law enforcement, overwhelmed by the size of the new illegal industry, focused on the most obvious violators while mostly ignoring well-organized operations that did not attract attention through violence or carelessness. Ralph's role grew quickly as the operation expanded. He managed money for dozens of businesses, coordinated supply chains that stretched from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, and supervised a workforce that included hundreds of legal employees and contract workers. His reputation for reliability and discretion attracted business from other criminal organizations, and Ralph started providing services like hiding illegal money, coordinating supplies, and settling arguments. To competitors as well as allies, this was a planned strategy. By making himself valuable to multiple organizations, Ralph created a network of mutual dependence that went beyond traditional territorial boundaries. Gangs that might have been enemies found themselves cooperating because they all relied on Ralph's systems for critical business functions. The key was keeping strict separation between the different parts of the operation. Legal businesses operated legally with proper books, tax payments, and following regulations. Illegal activities were kept in separate compartments with different people handling different jobs and limited knowledge of the overall operation. Financial records were kept in multiple formats with legal deals written down completely and illegal profits carefully hidden through legal businesses. Ralph's attention to small details became famous. He personally checked every significant money transaction, insisted on quality control for all products, and kept detailed information on law enforcement activities, political developments, and what competitors were doing. His office, located above the bottling plant, became the control center for an operation that was making millions of dollars every year. By 1923, the relationship with Al grew as their separate jobs expanded. Al handled enforcement, territory management, and public relations, the visible parts of their operations. Ralph managed money, logistics, and long-term planning, the invisible structure that made everything else possible. They met regularly, usually early in the morning before the legal businesses opened, to coordinate activities and make big decisions, despite their different roles. The brothers shared a common understanding of what they were building. This was not just a criminal operation. It was a business empire that happened to operate partly outside the law. They used legal business practices wherever possible, kept high-quality standards for their products, and provided services that customers genuinely wanted. Ralph insisted on treating employees well, no matter if they worked for legal or illegal parts of the operation. Wages were above what others paid, working conditions were safe, and loyalty was rewarded with more responsibility and better pay. This approach created a workforce that was both skilled and good at keeping secrets. These were essential qualities in an industry where employee mistakes could result in prison or death. The political relationships that Torio had established proved crucial to the operation's success too. Chicago's political machine was advanced and practical, more interested in managing vice than eliminating it. Politicians understood that prohibition could not be enforced in a practical way, and that well-organized criminal operations could actually help keep order by preventing the chaos that would result from purely competitive markets. Ralph developed his own political relationships, focusing on officials who controlled regulatory agencies, tax collection, and business licenses. These relationships were maintained through a mix of direct payments, legal business partnerships, and mutual political support. Ralph understood that in Chicago, politics and business could not be separated, and success required being good at both. By 1924, the Capone Torio organization had grown into something that had never existed before in American criminal history. They controlled production facilities in multiple states, transportation networks that reached from coast to coast, and stores in dozens of cities. Their legal businesses were genuinely profitable and provided cover for illegal activities that made far more money than traditional organized crime had ever achieved. Ralph's personal wealth showed the organization's success. He owned properties in Chicago and New York, kept bank accounts in multiple states, and had started investing in legal businesses beyond those directly connected to the criminal operation. Unlike traditional criminal leaders who lived in flashy ways, Ralph kept a pretty modest lifestyle, understanding that attracting attention did not help you succeed in the long run. The organization's success created new challenges. Competing criminal groups recognized how profitable the Capone-Torio model was and tried to copy it. Law enforcement agencies, initially overwhelmed by enforcing prohibition, started developing special units focused on organized crime. Political relationships that had seemed stable became subject to change as new officials took office in public. Attitudes toward organized crime changed. Most significantly, the enormous profits generated by the illegal alcohol trade attracted attention from criminal organizations throughout the country. Chicago became a battlefield as various groups tried to set up their own operations or take over existing ones. The period of working together and expanding that had characterized the early years of Prohibition was ending, replaced by increasingly violent competition for control of the market. Ralph recognized these changing conditions before many other people did. In planning sessions with Al and Torio, He argued for defensive measures, better security, more careful screening of new employees, less risk from expanding too much. He also started making backup plans for possible legal challenges, political changes, and competitive threats. We have built something amazing, Ralph told his partners in late 1924, but we have also painted a target on ourselves. Every ambitious crew in the country wants what we have, and every politician looking to make a name for themselves is going to be looking for someone to prosecute. We need to be ready for both. Torio, whose instincts had guided the organization's early growth, was starting to feel the strain of managing such a complicated operation while dealing with increasing outside pressure. Al was doing well in the violent atmosphere that was becoming common as competition got more intense. But Ralph understood that the era of fast, fairly peaceful expansion was ending. The challenge would be keeping what they had built while adjusting to a more dangerous and competitive environment. Ralph's business sense had created the foundation for their success. But the next phase would require different skills. The ability to operate under constant threat, to make big decisions with incomplete information, and to keep organizational discipline when outside pressure was pushing toward chaos and violence. As 1925 began, Ralph Capone was 26 years old and one of the most powerful men in Chicago. He controlled business operations that made millions of dollars every year, employed thousands of people, and influenced political and economic decisions throughout the Midwest. He had achieved wealth and influence beyond anything his immigrant parents could have imagined. But he was also about to enter the most dangerous phase of his career. The quiet, methodical approach that had built their empire was about to be tested by forces that Ralph's careful planning could not completely control. The ambitions of competitors, the changing attitudes of law enforcement, and the violent instincts of his own brother, whose way of solving problems was becoming increasingly different from Ralph's preference for negotiation and patient strategy. The empire they had built together was about to face its biggest challenges, and Ralph's ability to adjust his business-focused approach to a more brutal environment would decide not just his own survival, but the fate of everything he had worked to create. The year 1925 marked a turning point, not just for Ralph Capone, but for organized crime in America. Johnny Torio, the teacher who had shaped both Capone brothers, was almost killed in an assassination attempt by the North Side Gang. As he lay recovering in the hospital, Torio made a decision that would reshape the Chicago underworld forever. "I am getting out," Torio told Ralph and Al during a quiet meeting in his hospital room. "This business is getting too violent, too unpredictable. I am turning everything over to you boys. Al, you will be the public face. Handle the day-to-day operations, Ralph. You will continue managing the business side. But now you will also be my strategic successor. Everything I have built, everything I have learned about running this kind of organization, it is yours now." Ralph understood how big what Torio was offering was, and the weight it represented. At 26, Al was about to become the official head of the most powerful criminal organization in America. But Ralph, at 28, would be the one designing its continued growth and protecting its long-term survival. The change happened smoothly, which showed how good the organizational structure Ralph had helped create was. Unlike traditional criminal operations that depended entirely on their leaders' personal relationships and authority, the Capone operation had systems, procedures, and established hierarchies that could work no matter who was in the top position. Ralph's first priority was securing their existing territories, while getting ready for the increased competition that Al's more aggressive leadership style would inevitably attract. He expanded their legal business operations, understanding that as their illegal activities became more visible, they would need stronger legal cover and more different sources of income. The bottling operations, which had started with a single small plant, expanded to include facilities in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. Ralph personally supervised the design of each new facility, making sure they could serve legal customers while keeping the ability for illegal production. He also set up quality control standards that made Capone products known for being consistent and pure. Important advantages in a market where many competitors sold dangerous, poorly made alcohol. Ralph's approach to expansion was methodical and strategic, rather than just taking territory by force, which was Al's preferred method. Ralph preferred to create money reasons for cooperation. He offered better prices to suppliers who worked only with the Capone organization. He provided better protection services to illegal bar owners who carried only Capone products. He set up credit arrangements and business partnerships that made it financially better for other organizations to work with them rather than against them. This strategy proved remarkably effective. While other criminal organizations wasted resources fighting territorial wars, the Capone operation grew through negotiated agreements, strategic alliances, and mutually beneficial business arrangements. Ralph understood that in the illegal alcohol industry, cooperation was more profitable than competition, at least when you were big enough and well organized enough to set the terms of cooperation. The financial results were extraordinary. By 1926, Ralph was managing cash flows that exceeded those of many legal corporations. The organization's total income approached $100 million annually, equivalent to billions in today's money. More importantly, Ralph had developed systems for turning illegal profits into legal assets, making sure their wealth would survive changes in law enforcement priorities or political conditions. Ralph's investment strategy was advanced and far-seeing. He bought real estate in developing areas of Chicago, expecting future growth and understanding that owning property provided both legal income and political influence. He invested in legal businesses, restaurants, hotels, entertainment places that served as both money laundering operations and sources of real profit. He kept bank accounts in multiple states and started looking into international banking, relationships that could provide extra security for their collected wealth. The lifestyle that came with this success was exciting, but Ralph approached it with his usual caution. While Al embraced the celebrity that came with being Chicago's most famous gangster, Ralph kept a lower profile. He lived well. A big house in a respectable neighborhood, nice clothes, good cars, but he avoided the flashy displays that attracted unwanted attention. Ralph's social life showed his strategic approach to business. He developed relationships with legal businessmen, politicians, and community leaders, understanding that influence was as valuable as money. His dinner parties brought together diverse groups: criminal associates, legal business owners, political figures, and cultural leaders. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided cover for business discussions. They created opportunities for mutually beneficial relationships. And they established Ralph as an important figure in Chicago's wider community. The difference with Al's approach was striking. While Al's social circle consisted mostly of fellow criminals and entertainment figures, Ralph moved easily between multiple worlds. He was equally comfortable discussing market conditions with legal businessmen and territorial arrangements with criminal leaders. This flexibility made him extremely valuable as a negotiator and long-term planner. Ralph's role in the organization's most famous operations was typically invisible, but crucial. When the organization decided to eliminate competition from the O'Banion gang, Ralph handled the logistical planning while Al managed the operational details. Ralph figured out the best timing, arranged alibis for key participants, and made sure the aftermath would not disrupt their business operations. His preparation was so thorough that the organization actually increased its market share in the immediate aftermath of the violence. Taking advantage of the temporary chaos to get new customers and suppliers, the street Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 represented both the peak of the organization's power and the beginning of its decline. Though Ralph was one of the few who recognized the second part immediately, Al had ordered the elimination of the remaining North Side gang leadership, and the operation was tactically successful. 7 rivals were killed in a carefully planned ambush that appeared to be a police raid. But Ralph understood that the massacre represented a strategic failure. The level of violence was unheard of, attracting national attention and creating enormous pressure for law enforcement to respond. More importantly, it showed that Al's approach to solving problems was becoming increasingly dependent on force rather than negotiation. "We have made a mistake," Ralph told Al in the aftermath of the massacre. "This is not going to solve our problems. It is going to create new ones. The public will not tolerate this level of violence forever. And the federal government is going to get involved, whether we want them to or not." Al disagreed. He was high on the immediate results of the operation. With their major rivals eliminated, the Capone organization controlled more territory and made more money than ever before. But Ralph's concerns proved correct. Federal authorities, who had previously left Chicago crime to local law enforcement, started investigating the organization with resources and determination that had never been seen before. Ralph's response to this new threat showed his advanced understanding of both criminal and legal business. He started putting into place what would later be recognized as one of the first complete money laundering systems in American criminal history. Illegal profits were sent through multiple legal businesses, turned into assets that could not be easily traced, and invested in businesses that provided ongoing income independent of criminal activities. He also started making backup plans for possible legal challenges. Ralph studied tax law, immigration regulations, and federal criminal laws, understanding that the government's most likely way to attack would be through financial crimes, rather than direct evidence of illegal activities. He worked with legal accountants and lawyers to make sure that their business practices, while still serving criminal purposes, could stand up to legal examination. The organization's legal businesses became increasingly important during this period. Ralph's restaurants were genuinely popular. His hotels provided excellent service, and his other businesses competed successfully in their respective markets. This success served multiple purposes. It provided cover for illegal activities. It made legal income that could be reported to tax authorities. And it created political and community support that offered some protection against law enforcement pressure. Ralph's management style grew as the organization got bigger and more complex. He developed advanced systems for keeping security while making sure operations ran efficiently. Different aspects of the business were kept in separate compartments with limited communication between operational units. Financial records were kept in multiple formats with legal deals written down completely, while illegal activities were recorded in coded systems that could be destroyed if necessary. Managing people became increasingly complex as the organization employed hundreds of people in various jobs. Ralph set up clear levels of authority, well-defined responsibilities, and pay systems that rewarded both skill and loyalty. He also put security measures in place to prevent undercover law enforcement agents from getting in, and to make sure that employees could not provide damaging information. even if arrested and pressured to cooperate. The challenges of managing such a large organization were unheard of in criminal history. Ralph was essentially running a multi-state corporation with complex production, distribution, and store operations while maintaining the secrecy and flexibility required for an illegal enterprise. Traditional business management techniques had to be adapted for an environment where standard legal protections did not exist and where business arguments were often settled through violence. Ralph's personal life during this period showed the tension between his desire to be seen as legal and the reality of his criminal activities. He married Velma Feely in 1927. She was a woman from a respectable middle class family who understood his legal business interests, but remained mostly unaware of the full extent of his criminal activities. Their wedding was a big event attended by Chicago's social and political elite, and served as a public statement of Ralph's integration into legal society. Velma represented everything Ralph wanted for himself: respectability, social standing, and distance from the violent world that increasingly consumed his brother. She was smart, well-educated, and moved comfortably in the social circles that Ralph needed to develop for both personal and business reasons. Their marriage was genuinely loving, but it required Ralph to keep a careful separation between his home life and his criminal businesses. The couple's Chicago home became a center for entertaining that served Ralph's strategic purposes while providing him with the stable family life he wanted. Dinner parties brought together diverse groups: legal businessmen, political figures, community leaders, and carefully chosen associates from the organization. Velma proved to be an excellent hostess, helping conversations and relationships that benefited Ralph's various interests, while keeping the social atmosphere that prevented their gatherings from looking like criminal meetings. Ralph's relationship with his extended family also grew during this period of success. He was able to provide financial security for his parents and younger brothers and sisters, moving them out of the Chicago neighborhoods, where they might be targeted by rivals, and into comfortable homes in safer areas. His generosity was genuine, but it also served strategic purposes. Family members who were well cared for were less likely to become security risks, and Ralph's reputation as a devoted family man improved his standing in the Italian-American community. The success of the late 1920s created challenges that Ralph had not fully expected. Managing enormous amounts of cash required increasingly advanced systems. Ralph set up relationships with banks throughout the Midwest, keeping multiple accounts under various names and business entities. He also started looking into international banking, understanding that spreading money across national boundaries would provide extra security for their collected wealth. Real estate became a particular focus of Ralph's investment strategy. He bought properties throughout Chicago and in other major cities, often through middleman companies that hid his ownership. These investments served multiple purposes. They provided legal income. They offered potential safe houses and operation bases. And they represented assets that would keep their value no matter what happened to the illegal alcohol trade. Ralph's business philosophy during this golden period was shaped by his understanding that prohibition would not last forever. While Al and many of their associates lived as though the enormous profits from illegal alcohol would continue forever, Ralph planned for the transition. He studied other industries, looking for legal businesses that could provide substantial income when the illegal alcohol trade ended. Entertainment places became a particular focus. Ralph invested in nightclubs, theaters, and restaurants, understanding that these businesses benefited from being associated with the excitement and glamour of the Prohibition era, while also being positioned to succeed after Prohibition ended. His establishments became known for high-quality entertainment, excellent service, and the kind of sophisticated atmosphere that attracted customers willing to pay top prices. The management challenges of this period were unheard of. Ralph was overseeing operations that covered multiple states and involved hundreds of employees, suppliers, and business partners. Traditional organized crime had been based on personal relationships and local territories. But Ralph's operation required corporate-style management systems adapted for illegal activities. Communication was a constant challenge. Important business discussions could not be held over telephone lines that might be monitored by law enforcement. Written records had to be detailed enough to manage complex operations while being coded or kept in separate compartments to prevent them from providing evidence of criminal activity. Ralph developed elaborate systems of verbal communication, coded messages, and secure meeting procedures that allowed the organization to function efficiently while maintaining security. Quality control became increasingly important as the organization's reputation for reliable, high-quality products became one of its main competitive advantages. Ralph personally supervised the development of production standards, testing procedures, and delivery methods that ensured customers received consistent products. This attention to detail required significant investment in equipment, people, and procedures. But it created customer loyalty that was worth far more than the extra costs. The relationship with law enforcement during this period was complex and constantly changing. Local police in many areas had been successfully bribed or neutralized through a mix of payments, political pressure, and strategic cooperation. Ralph understood that completely opposing law enforcement was neither possible nor desirable. It was better to create relationships that allowed both sides to exist together while serving their respective interests. Federal law enforcement presented different challenges. Federal agents were generally better trained, less open to local political pressure, and focused specifically on violations of prohibition and related federal laws. Ralph's response was to make sure that the organization's operations were set up to minimize federal exposure, while keeping the local relationships that provided day-to-day protection. Ralph's intelligence network became one of the organization's most valuable assets. He kept contacts within law enforcement agencies, political organizations, and competing criminal operations, providing early warning of possible threats and opportunities. This information allowed the organization to avoid major law enforcement operations, take advantage of competitors' weaknesses, and adapt quickly to changing conditions. The financial sophistication of Ralph's operations during this period was remarkable. He was essentially running a multi-million-dollar corporation with complex production, distribution, and store operations while keeping the secrecy and flexibility required for a legal enterprise. His accounting systems were designed to serve multiple purposes, providing accurate information for business decisions, creating legal records for legal businesses, and maintaining believable deniability for illegal activities. Tax compliance became an increasingly important concern as federal authorities started focusing on financial crimes as a way to prosecute criminals who could not be convicted of their main illegal activities. Ralph worked with legal accountants to make sure that reported income from legal businesses matched visible lifestyle and known assets while developing systems to hide illegal income that could not be legally explained. The period from 1925 to 1929 represented the peak of Ralph's influence and success. He had built something unheard of in American criminal history, a business enterprise that operated across multiple states, employed thousands of people, and made profits that matched those of legal corporations. More importantly, he had done so while keeping the respect of both criminal associates and legal businessmen, creating a unique position in American society. But Ralph was also starting to see signs that this golden era was approaching its end. Public attitudes toward organized crime were hardening as the violence associated with illegal alcohol became more visible and more extreme. Federal law enforcement was developing special techniques and resources specifically designed to fight organized crime. Most concerning, All's leadership style was becoming increasingly dependent on violence and threats rather than the careful, strategic cooperation that had built their success. The stock market crash of October 1929 marked the beginning of the end of the Prohibition era's golden years. While the immediate impact on illegal alcohol sales was minimal, people still wanted to drink, no matter what the economy was doing. The crash created political and social pressures that would eventually change American attitudes toward organized crime and government regulation. Ralph recognized that they were entering a new and more dangerous phase. The methods that had built their empire would need to be adapted for a world where public tolerance for organized crime was decreasing, where federal law enforcement resources were increasing, and where the easy profits of early prohibition were being replaced by more intense competition and greater risk. As 1929 ended, Ralph Capone was 30 years old and controlled a business empire worth tens of millions of dollars. He had achieved wealth, influence, and power beyond anything his immigrant parents could have imagined. But he was also about to face the greatest challenges of his career. Challenges that would test not only his business sense, but his ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world where the rules that had guided his success were being rewritten by forces beyond his control. The golden years were ending, and Ralph's greatest test was about to begin. The stock market crash of October 29, 1929, shook every level of American society, and the Capone organization was not safe from its effects. While illegal alcohol sales stayed pretty steady, people drank to forget their troubles, no matter what the economy was doing. The crash marked the start of basic changes that would eventually destroy the empire Ralph had helped build. Ralph understood what it meant immediately. In a meeting with All and their top lieutenants just days after Black Tuesday, he explained the challenges they would face. "This is not just about the stock market," Ralph explained. Spreading financial newspapers across the conference table in their legal office above the bottling plant, "This is about everything changing. The government is going to need someone to blame for the economic collapse. Politicians are going to be looking for someone to accuse, someone to prosecute, someone to point to as an example of everything that is wrong with America. We are perfect targets." Al, still high on their apparent invulnerability, dismissed Ralph's concerns. "We have the best lawyers, the best political connections, the most money. Let them come after us. We have handled everything they have thrown at us so far." But Ralph had been tracking federal law enforcement activities for months, and he recognized that something basic had changed. The casual bribery that had protected them throughout the 1920s was being replaced by professional investigative techniques and dedicated federal resources. More concerning, public attitudes toward organized crime were hardening as economic desperation made people less tolerant of obvious wealth coming from illegal activities. The first major blow came in 1931, when All was charged with not paying his taxes. Ralph had been getting ready for this possibility for years, keeping detailed records of legal income sources and developing explanations for All's visible wealth that could stand up to legal examination. But the federal prosecutors, led by agents who understood organized crime better than their predecessors, had developed evidence that was hard to argue against. Ralph's own legal situation was more complex, but potentially more dangerous. His role as the organization's money manager meant that he had detailed knowledge of every major deal, every significant decision, and every important relationship. If federal agents could force him to cooperate, they could destroy not just the Capone organization, but dozens of related criminal operations throughout the Midwest. The pressure started subtly. Bank accounts were frozen while investigations happened. Legal businesses were subjected to intensive audits. Properties were taken based on claims that they had been bought with illegal money. Ralph found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts while trying to keep the organization's day-to-day operations going. His marriage to Velma became strained as the reality of his criminal activities became impossible to hide. Federal agents appeared at their home, served legal papers at social gatherings, and made it clear that being associated with Ralph carried legal and social risks. Velma, who had married a successful businessman, found herself married to a famous criminal whose name appeared regularly in newspaper headlines. "I knew you were not completely legal," she told Ralph during one of many difficult conversations about their future. "But I thought you were just bending the rules a little. I never imagined this. I never thought I would be afraid to answer my own door." Ralph's response showed his understanding that his criminal activities had consequences far beyond his own life. "I never wanted this to touch you," he said. "Everything I did was supposed to protect the people I care about, to build something that would last. But I may have made mistakes about what was possible and what the costs would be." The investigation into Ralph's activities was thorough and professionally done. Federal agents working with new techniques and resources that had not been available during the early years of Prohibition systematically traced financial transactions, found patterns of illegal activity, and built cases that could stand up to legal challenges. Ralph's advanced money laundering systems, which had successfully hidden illegal income for years, became problems as investigators used advanced accounting techniques to find differences and unexplained wealth. Properties that had been bought through middleman companies were traced back to Ralph through careful examination of financial records. Bank accounts that had seemed secure were found through new cooperation agreements between federal and state authorities. More damaging than the financial investigation was the systematic pressure applied to Ralph's associates and employees. Federal agents offered deals to lower-level participants in exchange for testimony about higher-level activities. They threatened to prosecute family members and business partners who had previously seemed beyond the reach of law enforcement. They used new federal laws against organized crime to prosecute individuals who had never directly participated in violent crimes, but who had provided services to criminal organizations. Ralph's response showed both his business sense and his understanding of legal realities. Rather than fighting the investigations directly, a strategy that would have been expensive and probably unsuccessful, he started systematically taking apart the empire he had helped build. Legal businesses were sold to buyers who had no connection to criminal activities, often at significant losses that showed how urgent the sales were. Financial assets were transferred to family members and trusted associates who could not be directly connected to illegal activities. Properties that could not be legally explained were abandoned rather than defended in court proceedings that would require revealing damaging information. The process was emotionally devastating. Ralph was basically destroying everything he had worked to build, giving up years of careful planning and collected wealth in an attempt to minimize the legal consequences for himself and his family. But he understood that the alternative, trying to keep criminal operations going while facing a steady federal investigation, would be even more costly. His relationship with Al became increasingly strained as their different approaches to the crisis became clear. Al wanted to fight, to use violence and threats to stop people from cooperating with federal investigators. Ralph understood that such tactics would only give more evidence to prosecutors while failing to address the basic problem of Overwhelming federal resources focused on their destruction. "You are giving up," Al accused Ralph during one particularly heated argument. "You are letting them destroy everything we built without even fighting." Ralph's response showed his broader understanding of the situation they faced. "I am not giving up. I am adapting to new circumstances. The world has changed, and the methods that worked in the past will not work now. If we do not adjust, we will lose everything. If we do adjust, we might save something." The adjustment required accepting losses that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. Ralph's personal wealth, which had peaked at several $1,000,000 in the late 1920s, was reduced to a tiny part of that amount as properties were sold. Assets were taken, and legal costs used up enormous resources. More painful was the breaking up of relationships and partnerships that had taken years to develop and that had provided both business opportunities and personal satisfaction. Ralph's intelligence network, which had been one of the organization's most valuable assets, became a problem as federal investigators found his sources within law enforcement agencies and political organizations. Several of his most valuable contacts were prosecuted for bribery, while others distanced themselves from any association with organized crime activities. The legal businesses that Ralph had developed as both cover and genuine enterprises were also affected by the investigation. Customers and suppliers became reluctant to deal with companies that were associated with famous criminals. Bank loans were called in, insurance policies were canceled, and permits were delayed or denied. Ralph watched years of careful business development destroyed by association with activities that had originally been designed to support those same businesses. By 1932, the Capone organization, as Ralph had known it, had basically stopped existing. Al was in federal prison serving an 11-year sentence for not paying taxes. Most of their major assets had been sold, taken, or abandoned. The network of legal businesses that had provided both cover and income had been taken apart. The political relationships that had provided protection had been cut off. Ralph himself faced multiple federal charges related to not paying taxes, conspiracy, and violating Prohibition laws. Unlike Al, who had tried to fight the charges through expensive and ultimately unsuccessful legal challenges, Ralph chose to negotiate, working with experienced federal prosecutors. He reached agreements that minimized his prison sentence in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations of other criminal organizations. The cooperation was limited and strategic. Ralph provided information about financial structures and business methods, but avoided testimony that would directly connect individuals to violent crimes. He helped federal agents understand how advanced criminal organizations hid money and kept legal business fronts, but refused to provide evidence that would support murder prosecutions. Ralph's prison sentence, 3 years in federal custody, was pretty light considering how extensive his criminal activities were. But the real punishment was the destruction of everything he had worked to build, and the knowledge that his life's work had ultimately been pointless. During his time in federal prison, Ralph had the chance to think about the choices he had made and their consequences. He was housed with other white-collar criminals rather than violent offenders, and the relative quiet of prison life provided a sharp contrast to the constant pressure and activity that had filled his previous decade. Prison also gave Ralph perspective on the broader changes that had happened in American society. Prohibition was ending, eliminating the basic business opportunity that had made the Capone organization possible. The federal government was developing law enforcement abilities that made large-scale organized crime far more difficult and dangerous. Most importantly, public attitudes toward criminal organizations had fundamentally changed. We were part of something that could not last, Ralph wrote in a letter to Velma during his time in prison. We thought we were building something permanent, but we were really just taking advantage of a temporary situation. When the situation changed, everything we built became impossible to maintain. Ralph was released from federal prison in 1935 at the age of 36. He came out into a world that had been fundamentally changed by the Great Depression, the end of Prohibition, and the federal government's successful campaign against organized crime. The opportunities that had made his criminal career possible no longer existed, and the skills that had made him successful in a legal enterprise were not easily moved to the legal business world. Velma had divorced him while he was in prison. Unable to accept the reality of his criminal activities, and unwilling to continue to deal with the ongoing social and legal consequences of being associated with his name, most of his former associates were either dead, in prison, or had distanced themselves from organized crime. The fortune he had built up over a decade of criminal activity was mostly gone, eaten up by legal costs, property seizures, and the costs of taking apart the organization he had helped build. Ralph's attempts to rebuild his life in the legal business world were made difficult by his reputation and the continuing attention of law enforcement agencies. Possible business partners were reluctant to associate with someone whose name was linked with organized crime. Bank loans were hard to get. Even routine business permits required extensive background checks that often resulted in denials. The period from 1935 to 1940 was marked by small attempts to set up legal businesses. Ongoing legal and financial problems resulting from his criminal past, and the gradual recognition that his former life had permanently limited his future opportunities. Ralph opened a small restaurant, worked as a consultant for other businessmen, and tried to use his organizational skills in legal situations. But the shadow of his criminal career followed him everywhere. Customers stayed away from businesses associated with his name. Suppliers demanded cash payments instead of extending normal credit terms. Government agencies subjected his activities to constant examination that made normal business operations difficult or impossible. More painful than the business difficulties was the social isolation that resulted from his fame. Former friends and associates avoided him, understanding that being associated with Ralph Capone carried risks they were unwilling to accept. Family relationships were strained by the attention and danger that his presence brought to relatives who were trying to build legal lives. Ralph's health started to suffer under the stress of his changed circumstances. The constant pressure of criminal life, followed by imprisonment, followed by the struggle to rebuild in the legal world, had taken a physical and emotional toll that became increasingly clear as he entered middle age. By 1940, Ralph Capone was 41 years old and a shadow of the powerful figure he had been a decade earlier. The empire he had helped build was a memory. The wealth he had built up was mostly gone, and the future he had planned seemed impossible to achieve. He was about to enter the most difficult phase of his life, a long struggle to find meaning and purpose in a world that would never forget what he had been, but would never again offer him the chance to be what he had hoped to become. Ralph Capone woke up on his 41st birthday in a small apartment above a failing restaurant on Chicago's South Side. The difference from his surroundings a decade earlier could not have been more stark. Gone were the luxurious homes, the collection of expensive cars, the army of associates and employees. In their place was a bare two-room apartment, furnished with used furniture and the constant worry of being able to pay the rent on time. The restaurant below, Ralph's Italian Kitchen, was his latest attempt to build something legal from the wreckage of his former empire. The irony did not escape him that he was now struggling to make a living in the food service industry. the same business that had provided cover for criminal operations that once made millions of dollars every year. The restaurant showed both Ralph's reduced circumstances and his continuing belief that hard work and attention to detail could overcome any problem. The menu was small but carefully prepared, featuring dishes that Ralph had learned to cook during his childhood in the Capone household. The service was attentive, the prices were fair, and the atmosphere was deliberately modest. Nothing that would attract unwanted attention or remind customers of Ralph's famous past. But Ralph's reputation went before him everywhere. Possible customers who recognized his name often stayed away, not wanting to eat at an establishment owned by a former gangster. Those who did come were often curious people rather than regular customers, more interested in seeing a famous criminal than in enjoying a good meal. The steady customer base that any restaurant needed to survive proved hard to find. The business challenges were made worse by ongoing legal and financial problems. The Internal Revenue Service kept claims on any property or income that could be connected to Ralph's name, saying that he still owed significant taxes on income from his criminal period. Bank loans were impossible to get, forcing Ralph to operate on a cash-only basis that limited his ability to expand or improve the restaurant. More frustrating than the business difficulties was the social isolation that had become a permanent feature of Ralph's life. Former associates from his criminal period were either dead, in prison, or had successfully distanced themselves from their past activities. Attempts to make new friendships were made difficult by Ralph's fame and the assumption that anyone who associated with him must be involved in criminal activities. Even family relationships stayed strained. Ralph's parents, now in their 70s, were proud of their son's attempts to build a legal life, but remained fearful of the attention that his presence brought to the family. His younger brothers and sisters had built successful careers and respectable lives, and while they kept in touch with Ralph, they were careful to limit the association to private family gatherings. The divorce from Velma had been made final during Ralph's time in prison, and his attempts to start new romantic relationships were made difficult by his reputation and reduced circumstances. Women who might have been attracted to his intelligence and business sense were put off by the social and legal risks of being associated with someone whose name appeared regularly in newspaper accounts of organized crime history. Ralph's daily routine during this period showed his determination to rebuild while accepting the limitations imposed by his past. He got up early each morning to prepare food for the restaurant, handling much of the cooking himself to keep labor costs down. He spent afternoons managing the business, ordering supplies, keeping equipment running, handling the simple accounting that his reduced operations required. Evenings were often spent alone in his apartment, reading newspapers and books, following political and economic developments, and thinking about the choices that had led him to his current situation. Ralph had always been an analytical person, and his years of being alone gave him plenty of time to examine his life with a kind of systematic attention. He had once applied to criminal enterprises. The examination was both revealing and painful. Ralph could identify specific decisions that had contributed to his downfall, moments when he had chosen short-term profits over long-term security, times when he had relied too heavily on relationships that proved unreliable, times when he had underestimated the risks of his activities. But he also understood that his basic approach had been wrong from the beginning. "I thought I could control everything," he wrote in a journal that he started keeping during this period. "I thought that if I was smart enough, careful enough, thorough enough, I could build something that would last no matter what outside forces did. But I was trying to build a legal empire using illegal methods. and that conflict made everything I built basically unstable. The journal entries, written during long evenings in his small apartment, gave Ralph a way to express thoughts and feelings that he could share with no one else. They also showed how deeply he regretted the consequences his activities had brought to others. Family members who had been embarrassed or endangered, employees who had lost their jobs when the organization fell apart, legal business partners who had suffered financially from association with his enterprises. Ralph's attempts to rebuild were not completely unsuccessful. The restaurant, despite its problems, did attract a small but loyal customer base. Some diners came because they appreciated good food, prepared carefully and served honestly. Others were drawn by Ralph's personal story, not his criminal fame, but his efforts to create something positive from the wreckage of his past. Ralph's interactions with these customers showed parts of his personality that had been hidden during his criminal career. Without the need to keep up the careful appearance required by illegal activities, he could be more real in his relationships. Customers often found him to be an intelligent, thoughtful man who was genuinely interested in their lives and experiences. These relationships, limited though they were, gave Ralph some of the social connection he had been missing. Regular customers would ask about his health, share news about their families, and offer the kind of casual friendship that had been impossible during his criminal career, when every relationship carried possible risks. But Ralph's past continued to interrupt his attempts to build a normal life. From time to time, reporters researching stories about organized crime would seek him out for interviews. Law enforcement agencies investigating other criminals would question him about his knowledge of past activities. Former associates facing their own legal troubles would sometimes connect Ralph to criminal activities, requiring him to hire lawyers and defend himself against charges related to crimes from decades ago. Each of these incidents disrupted Ralph's carefully maintained quiet life, attracting attention that drove away customers and reminded the community of his famous past. The restaurant's business would drop for weeks after each incident, forcing Ralph to use his small savings to keep operations going while waiting for public attention to move elsewhere. Ralph's health during this period showed the combined stress of his criminal career, imprisonment, and ongoing struggles to rebuild. He suffered from chronic stomach problems that he attributed to years of irregular eating and constant pressure. His sleep was often broken by nightmares about violent incidents from his criminal period. Most concerning, he experienced periods of depression and anxiety that made it difficult to keep up the optimistic appearance necessary for running a customer service business. Medical care was limited by Ralph's financial situation and his unwillingness to seek treatment that might create records of his condition. He treated most health problems with over-the-counter medicines and the kind of patient endurance that had marked his approach to other difficulties in his life. By 1945, Ralph had been running his restaurant for 5 years with mixed results. The business provided enough income to cover basic living costs, but offered no hope for significant growth or financial security. More importantly, Ralph was starting to understand that his hopes of rebuilding a successful business empire were unrealistic given his circumstances and reputation. The end of World War II brought changes to American society that further reduced Ralph's opportunities for legal success. The post-war economic boom created opportunities for many Americans, but those opportunities were generally available only to individuals with access to credit, business contacts, and social networks that Ralph's criminal past had made impossible for him to develop. Ralph's response to these limits was typical. He adjusted his expectations to match his circumstances, while continuing to work hard within the boundaries he faced. If he could not rebuild an empire, he would create a small but honest living. If he could not regain social respectability, He would find satisfaction in the respect of a small number of people who knew him personally rather than by reputation. The 1950s brought new challenges as Ralph entered his 50s with limited financial resources and declining health. The restaurant business became increasingly difficult as competition grew stronger, and his aging equipment needed repairs that strained his finances. More concerning, his criminal past continued to attract attention from both law enforcement agencies investigating historical crimes and reporters writing books and articles about the Prohibition era. Ralph's strategy for dealing with these intrusions changed from resistance to acceptance. Rather than refusing all interviews and cooperation with law enforcement, an approach that had often resulted in increased pressure and attention, he started giving limited cooperation while keeping boundaries around information that could hurt others or create additional legal problems for himself. This approach proved more successful than his earlier resistance. By giving historians and reporters general information about the structure and operations of organized crime during the Prohibition era, Ralph could satisfy much of their curiosity while avoiding specific details that might connect surviving individuals or create new legal problems for himself. Similarly, by giving law enforcement agencies information about historical activities that could no longer be prosecuted, Ralph could show cooperation while avoiding testimony that would require him to accuse former associates or reveal details about ongoing criminal activities. The personal cost of this approach was significant. Each interview, each cooperation session, each public discussion of his criminal past reinforced his fame and made it more difficult to keep the quiet, legal life he was trying to build. But Ralph understood that complete resistance was impossible, and that strategic cooperation might eventually reduce the attention focused on his activities. Ralph's family relationships during this period were marked by gradual coming back together, tempered by ongoing caution. His parents, now elderly, were proud of his efforts to build a legal life and grateful that he had survived the violence that had killed many of his former associates. But they remained concerned about the attention that his presence brought to family gatherings and the possible impact on his siblings' careers and reputations. His relationship with Al, who was released from prison in 1947, suffering from advanced syphilis, was complex and painful. The brothers who had once worked together to build a criminal empire were now both struggling with the consequences of their choices. But their circumstances were dramatically different. Al, whose mental abilities had been severely damaged by untreated syphilis, needed constant care and supervision. Ralph, despite his own limited resources, helped with Al's medical costs and visited him regularly. These visits were emotionally difficult, forcing Ralph to face a clear reminder of the ultimate pointlessness of everything they had built together. He does not remember most of it, Ralph wrote in his journal after one particularly difficult visit. Maybe that is a blessing. He does not remember the power, the money, the respect we thought we had earned, but he also does not remember the choices we made, the prices other people paid for our success, the inevitable consequences we should have seen coming. Al's death in 1947 marked the end of an era for Ralph. With his brother gone, Ralph was one of the few surviving senior figures from the Capone organization's golden years. The weight of that history and the responsibility of being its main living witness added to the isolation that had marked his life since his release from prison. The 1960s brought new challenges as Ralph entered his 60s, with very little financial security and declining health. The restaurant had provided a living for over 20 years, but it had never made enough income to build savings or provide for retirement. Ralph's health problems were becoming more serious and more expensive to treat, creating money pressures that made it difficult to keep his business going. More concerning was Ralph's growing recognition that his generation was dying off, taking with it the last direct connections to the world he had once lived in. Former associates, law enforcement officers who had investigated his activities, politicians who had dealt with the organization. Most were dead or too elderly to keep active lives. Ralph was becoming a historical curiosity rather than a current figure, valued mainly for his memories of a vanished era rather than his current activities or future potential. This change from current relevance to historical importance was psychologically difficult for Ralph. Throughout his criminal career and his subsequent attempts to rebuild, he had kept hope that he could create something meaningful for the future. The growing recognition that his main value lay in keeping memories of the past forced him to face the reality that his active life was basically over. Ralph's response to this understanding was characteristically practical. If his value lay in his historical knowledge, he would try to use that knowledge in a helpful way. He started working with legitimate historians and researchers, providing information about organized crime during the Prohibition era, while keeping boundaries around information that could hurt others or make criminal activity seem good. These partnerships gave Ralph a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for decades. Rather than just surviving day to day, he was adding to historical understanding of an important period in American history. The work also gave small extra income that helped make up for the decreasing profits from his restaurant. The work also forced Ralph to face the full extent of the violence and destruction that had come with his criminal career. In providing information about the organization's structure and operations, he had to acknowledge the murders, threats, and other violent crimes that had been essential to their success. A careful separation that had allowed him to focus on the business aspects of criminal activity while avoiding direct responsibility for violence became impossible to keep when discussing the organization's history completely. I told myself that I was just handling the business side, Ralph wrote during this period. I convinced myself that the violence was separate from what I was doing, that I could build something legal using illegal methods without being responsible for the inevitable consequences. But everything was connected. The violence made the business possible, and the business gave resources for more violence. I cannot claim credit for building something without accepting responsibility for how it was built and what it required. Ralph's health declined significantly during the late 1960s. The chronic stomach problems that had bothered him for decades got worse, requiring medical treatment that used up much of his small income. He also started having heart problems that limited his ability to work long hours in the restaurant. The combination of declining health and reduced income forced Ralph to make difficult decisions about his future. The restaurant, which had provided both income and purpose for nearly 30 years, was no longer financially possible. The equipment was worn out, the location was getting worse, and Ralph lacked both the physical ability and money needed for renovation. Ralph's decision to close the restaurant was emotionally devastating. The business had represented his main attempt to build something legal and positive from the wreckage of his criminal career. Its failure felt like a final confirmation that his hopes of redemption and rebuilding had been pointless. The closing was handled with typical dignity. Ralph personally told his regular customers, thanked his few employees, and paid all debts before giving the keys back to his landlord. There were no dramatic gestures or public statements, just the quiet end of an enterprise that had given meaning and purpose during the most difficult period of his life. Ralph spent his final years in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, living on Social Security benefits and the small income from his historical research work. His lifestyle was simple but comfortable. He had learned to live with very little during his years of rebuilding. and his needs were simple. The isolation that had marked much of his post-criminal life continued, but Ralph had made peace with being alone. He kept in touch with a few historians and researchers, got occasional visits from distant family members, and found satisfaction in reading, writing in his journal, and thinking about his long and complicated life. Ralph's final journal entries, written in the months before his death, showed a complex mix of regret, acceptance, and understanding. He acknowledged the harm that his criminal activities had caused to others, while recognizing that his later efforts to build a legal life had been genuine attempts at redemption. He expressed satisfaction with his survival and his avoidance of the violent death that had taken most of his former associates, while regretting the opportunities for legal success that his criminal choices had made impossible. "I lived 3 different lives," he wrote in one of his last entries. "The first was as a criminal who thought he could build something permanent using temporary methods. The second was as a man trying to escape the consequences of his choices while building something legal from nothing. The third was as someone who had learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments and quiet dignity rather than power and wealth. If I could do it again, I would make different choices. But I cannot change what I did, only what I learned from it. I hope that somehow the knowledge I gained about the costs of criminal success might help others avoid the mistakes I made." Ralph Capone died quietly in his sleep on November 22, 1974. At the age of 75, his death got very little attention from the media. A short obituary in Chicago newspapers that summarized his criminal career and noted his decades of legal life afterward. There were no speeches from powerful figures, no crowds of mourners, no dramatic final gestures. The funeral was attended by a small number of distant family members and a few individuals who had known Ralph during his years of legal business activity. The service was simple and dignified, showing the modest life that Ralph had built after the fall of his criminal empire. Ralph's belongings, such as they were, consisted mainly of personal items, a small savings account, and the extensive journals he had kept during his final decades. The journals, which recorded both his thoughts on his criminal career and his struggles to rebuild afterward, were given to the Chicago History Museum, where they would eventually give historians unique understanding of the personal costs of organized crime. His grave in Mount Carmel Cemetery was marked with a simple stone bearing his name and dates of birth and death. There were no references to his criminal fame, no dramatic epitaphs, no symbols of power or wealth. In death, as in his final years, Ralph Capone had achieved the being unknown that had escaped him for most of his adult life. And so ends the story of Ralph Bottles Capone, a man who built an empire in the shadows, managed an organization that defined an era, and lived to see it all fall apart. His story reminds us that behind every legend, there are the unknown builders, the quiet planners, the brothers who chose business over violence, yet still paid the ultimate price. Ralph's life was a study in opposites. A man who had genuine business genius, but used it for illegal purposes, who sought respectability through criminal means, who built something extraordinary that was doomed from the start. He was the accountant of America's most famous criminal organization, a financial builder of Prohibition-era organized crime, and ultimately a warning story about the impossible dream of building something permanent on basically unstable foundations. In many ways, Ralph's story is more tragic than that of his famous brother Al, where Al burned brightly and crashed spectacularly. Ralph's fall was slow, methodical, and complete. Al's imprisonment and early death kept his legend alive, freezing him in time as the symbol of criminal power. Ralph lived long enough to see his empire destroyed, his reputation ruined, his hopes of redemption mostly unfulfilled. Yet, there was dignity in Ralph's long struggle to rebuild. For 30 years after his release from prison, he worked honestly, lived quietly, and tried to add positively to society. His restaurant may have been modest, but it was legal. His cooperation with historians may have been limited, but it was helpful. His final decades may have been marked by isolation and money problems, but they were also marked by honesty and persistence. Ralph's journal entries from his final years show a man who had achieved a hard-won understanding of his life's meaning and consequences. He neither made his criminal success seem glorious nor completely condemned his choices, recognizing instead that his life had been shaped by both the opportunities available to him and the decisions he had made in response to those opportunities. "I was part of something that could not last," he had written, "but for a brief time it was extraordinary." That understanding, that he had taken part in a unique historical moment while paying a terrible personal price for that participation, gave Ralph a way to accept both his achievements and his failures. The broader meanings of Ralph's story extend far beyond organized crime. His life shows the tempting nature of illegal success, the difficulty of escaping the consequences of past choices, and the possibility of finding meaning and dignity even in failure. It shows that intelligence, skill, and determination are not enough to guarantee success if they are used for basically flawed enterprises. Ralph's story also shows the human cost of criminal enterprise. While popular culture often makes organized crime seem romantic, focusing on power, wealth, and excitement, Ralph's experience shows the isolation, fear, and ultimate pointlessness that mark criminal careers. His 30-year struggle to rebuild after the fall of his empire shows that the consequences of criminal choices extend far beyond imprisonment or violence. Perhaps most significantly, Ralph's story shows that redemption is possible, even if it is not complete. His efforts to build a legal life after his criminal career were mostly unsuccessful in terms of money, but they represented a genuine attempt to create something positive from the wreckage of his past. The modest restaurant that gave him purpose for nearly 3 decades may not have given back his wealth or reputation, but it allowed him to add honestly to his community and to find satisfaction in work that hurt no one. The difference between Ralph's peak years and his final decades also shows the temporary nature of criminal success. At the height of his power, Ralph controlled business operations worth millions of dollars, employed thousands of people, and influenced political and economic decisions throughout the Midwest. By the end of his life, he was a forgotten figure, living in being unknown on Social Security benefits. Yet, there was something admirable in how Ralph adjusted to these changed circumstances. He never publicly complained about his losses, never blamed others for his choices, never asked for sympathy for his reduced circumstances. Instead, he quietly adapted to each new limit, finding ways to create meaning and purpose within whatever boundaries he faced. Ralph's cooperation with historians in his final years represented perhaps his most successful attempt at helpful contribution to society. By sharing his knowledge of organized crime structure and operations, while keeping ethical boundaries around information that could hurt others, he helped keep historical understanding of an important period in American history. His insights were valuable precisely because they came from someone who had been deeply involved in the system he was describing, but who had also experienced its costs and limits. The journals that Ralph left behind gave a unique window into the mind of organized crime and the personal consequences of criminal choices. Unlike most historical sources about organized crime, which come from law enforcement officials, reporters, or academic researchers, Ralph's writings give the view of someone who had been central to criminal operations, but who had also lived long enough to understand their ultimate meaning and consequences. These writings show a thoughtful, analytical man who is capable of honest self-examination and genuine regret. They show that criminal success, however spectacular, cannot give the satisfaction and security that its pursuit seems to promise. They show that the skills and intelligence that make criminal success possible are often the same qualities that make its ultimate failure more painful and its consequences more lasting. Ralph's story also gives understanding of the broader social and economic forces that created the opportunities for organized crime during the Prohibition era. His success was made possible not just by his own abilities, but by a unique combination of social attitudes, legal conflicts, and money incentives that existed during a specific historical period. When those conditions changed, even the most advanced criminal organizations proved open to destruction. The change in American law enforcement during Ralph's career, from local, often bribed agencies to professional federal organizations with special training and resources, shows the broader growth of American institutions during the 20th century. Ralph's empire was built during a period when law enforcement was split up and often compromised, and it was destroyed when those conditions changed. Ralph's relationship with legal business throughout his career shows the complex boundaries between legal and illegal enterprise. His criminal activities were often impossible to tell apart from legal business operations, differing mainly in the products involved and the methods used to settle arguments. His success in building cover businesses that were genuinely profitable shows that his business skills were real even though they were used for illegal purposes. The failure of Ralph's attempts to move to completely legal business after his criminal career ended shows the lasting consequences of criminal association. Even after serving his prison sentence and showing his commitment to legal activity, Ralph found that his past reputation continued to limit his opportunities and complicate his efforts to rebuild. This part of Ralph's story has current relevance for discussions about criminal justice, reform, and the return of former offenders to society. Ralph's experience suggests that the formal completion of legal punishment does not automatically give back the opportunities necessary for a successful return to society, and that the unofficial consequences of criminal conviction may be more significant than the official penalties. Ralph's long life, he survived to age 75 in an era when most of his criminal associates died young and violently, gave him a unique view on the costs and consequences of organized crime. His survival allowed him to experience not just the immediate excitement and profits of criminal success, but also its long-term effects on personal relationships, money security, and social standing. The difference between Ralph's experience and that of his brother Al shows different possible paths for criminal careers. Al's spectacular rise and fall, ending in imprisonment and early death, kept his legend alive, but prevented him from experiencing the long-term consequences of his choices. Ralph's survival forced him to face those consequences and to find ways of living with them. In the end, Ralph Capone's story is both uniquely American and universal. It shows the opportunities and conflicts of American society during a period of fast social change, while also showing timeless themes about ambition, consequence, and redemption. His life shows that intelligence and ability, when used for basically flawed enterprises, can create spectacular short-term success that carries the seeds of its own destruction. But Ralph's story also shows human strength and the possibility of finding dignity in failure. His 30-year effort to rebuild his life after the fall of his criminal empire may not have given back his wealth or reputation, but it proved that redemption, however incomplete, remains possible even after the most serious mistakes. the quiet dignity of Ralph's final years, the modest success of his legal business, and his cooperation with historical research represent a form of success that was different from, but perhaps more meaningful than, the spectacular criminal achievements of his youth. They suggest that a life's value cannot be measured only by its highest accomplishments, but must also consider its response to failure and its addition to the broader human community. Ralph Capone died as he had lived his final decades, quietly, with dignity, and with the understanding that his life had been both extraordinary and tragic. He had been one of the builders of America's most advanced criminal enterprise, and he had paid the full price for that achievement. But he had also shown that it was possible to survive the consequences of such choices and to find meaning in the effort to build something better from their wreckage. His story reminds us that every empire has its unknown stories, that behind every legend there are human beings who made choices, paid prices, and lived with consequences. It suggests that the most important measure of a life may not be its greatest achievements, but its response to its greatest failures, and perhaps most importantly, Ralph's story shows that it is never too late to choose a different path, even if that path leads not to glory or wealth, but simply to the quiet satisfaction of honest work and the dignity of facing one's failures with courage and honesty. In the decades following Ralph Capone's quiet death in 1974, his story started to take on a different meaning. As historians dug deeper into the Prohibition era and the rise of organized crime in America, Ralph's role became increasingly clear, not as a background figure overshadowed by his famous brother, but as one of the most advanced criminal minds of his generation. The journals Ralph left behind, at first dismissed as the ramblings of a former gangster, proved to be treasures of information about the inner workings of organized crime. Academic researchers studying the documents found detailed insights into money laundering techniques that would not become common knowledge for decades. Organizational structures that were ahead of modern corporate management, and strategic thinking that showed the true complexity of Prohibition-era criminal enterprises. Margaret Thornton, a criminologist at the University of Chicago, who spent years studying Ralph's journals, described them as perhaps the most complete insider account of organized crime operations ever discovered. Her analysis showed that Ralph had basically invented many of the techniques that modern organized crime would later adopt. Keeping operations in separate compartments, having different sources of income, systematically bribing officials, and combining legal and illegal businesses. Ralph Capone was not just Al's quieter brother, Dr. Thornton wrote in her landmark study. He was arguably the most important criminal inventor of the 20th century. The methods he developed during Prohibition became the pattern for organized crime operations worldwide. This academic recognition came too late to help Ralph personally, but it gave context for understanding his lasting impact on American crime. The advanced money laundering techniques that federal authorities struggled to fight in later decades were often changes of systems that Ralph had developed in the 1920s. The corporate-style organization that marked major crime, families from the 1940s onward, showed organizational principles that Ralph had started. More interestingly, some of Ralph's legal business inventions proved to be ahead of their time. His approach to supply chain management, quality control, and customer service in the illegal alcohol trade included techniques that would not become standard in legal industries until decades later. Business schools that later studied his operations found principles that were ahead of modern management theory. The restaurant industry in particular showed traces of Ralph's influence long after his own modest establishment had closed. Several successful Chicago restaurateurs had worked in Ralph's kitchen during the 1950s and 1960s. learning approaches to food preparation, service, and customer relations that they carried into their own establishments. None publicly acknowledged the connection, but people in the industry recognized the distinctive style that could be traced back to Ralph's training. Ralph's impact on his neighborhood was more complex and lasting than most residents realized. During his 30 years running the restaurant, he had quietly given help to struggling families, helped young people find legal employment, and served as an unofficial mediator for local arguments. His reputation as a former gangster actually made him more effective in this role. People took his advice seriously because they knew he understood the consequences of poor choices. After Ralph's death, several community members came forward with stories of his quiet generosity. He had paid medical bills for elderly neighbors, given jobs to young men who might otherwise have turned to crime, and offered business advice to people hoping to start businesses. These activities were never publicized and left no official records, but they created a network of people whose lives had been positively influenced by his presence. The difference between Ralph's public reputation and his private actions during his later years showed the complexity of redemption and the difficulty of escaping past choices. To the wider public, he remained Al Capone's brother, a figure associated with violence and corruption. To those who knew him personally during his legal years, he was a thoughtful, generous man who had made serious mistakes, but had spent decades trying to make up for them. This two-sided nature became a subject of interest for sociologists studying criminal rehabilitation and return to society. Ralph's experience suggested that successful rehabilitation might be possible even after the most serious criminal careers, but that social forgiveness and acceptance were much more difficult to achieve. His case became a reference point for discussions about the lifelong consequences of criminal association and the barriers to successful return to society. The Chicago Police Department's Organized Crime Division kept the file on Ralph until his death, but the later entries told a story of gradual unimportance rather than continuing threat. Surveillance reports from the 1960s described a man whose main activities consisted of running a small restaurant, reading in the library, and taking solitary walks through his neighborhood. The change from one of America's most powerful criminals to a forgotten figure living on. Social Security showed the temporary nature of criminal power. Law enforcement officials who had known Ralph during his criminal period and met him again during his legal years often expressed surprise at the change. Detective William Morrison, who had investigated the Capone organization in the 1920s and later aided Ralph's restaurant, described the experience as unreal. "Here was a man I had tried to arrest for decades," Morrison recalled in his memoirs, "serving me pasta and asking about my grandchildren." He remembered details about cases from 30 years earlier, but he talked about them like ancient history. It was clear that he had genuinely changed, but it was also clear that the change had cost him everything he had once valued. Ralph's relationship with the changing neighborhood around his restaurant showed broader changes in American city life. The area where he worked had been a stable working-class community when he first opened, but city renewal projects and economic changes gradually changed its character. Ralph adapted to these changes with his usual practicality, changing his menu to show new population groups and learning enough Spanish to talk with his growing Latino customer base. These adaptations showed parts of Ralph's personality that had been hidden during his criminal career. His ability to learn languages, his sensitivity to cultural differences, and his skill at building relationships across ethnic boundaries suggested abilities that had been focused on criminal enterprises during his younger years, but found more positive expression in his later life. The slow gentrification that eventually changed Ralph's neighborhood also added to the decline of his restaurant business. Rising rents and changing customer preferences made his modest establishment increasingly not workable. But Ralph's response to these money pressures showed the patience and strategic thinking that had marked his approach to both criminal and legal enterprises. Rather than fighting changes he could not control, Ralph systematically wound down his operations while keeping quality and service standards until the end. Regular customers were given advance notice of the closing. Employees were helped to find new positions, and all debts were paid before the doors closed for the final time. The process showed the same attention to detail and concern for others that had marked his management of much larger enterprises decades earlier. Ralph's final years, spent in increasing isolation and declining health, might have seemed tragic to those who remembered his former power and wealth, but his own writings from this period suggest a man who had achieved a form of peace that had escaped him during his years of criminal success. "I have less now than I did as a young man in Brooklyn," he wrote in one of his final journal entries, "but I understand more. The wealth and power I thought I wanted were really just ways of avoiding the harder questions about what kind of person I wanted to be and what kind of life was worth living." This philosophical acceptance of his circumstances was perhaps Ralph's greatest achievement during his later years. He had learned to find satisfaction in small accomplishments rather than grand successes, to value genuine relationships over profitable associations, and to measure his worth by his daily actions rather than his collected wealth or reputation. The funeral that marked the end of Ralph's long life was attended by people who represented different phases of his complex career. Family members who remembered the young man with business dreams sat next to neighbors who knew only the elderly restaurateur. Former law enforcement officials who had chased him for decades joined community members who had benefited from his later generosity. The speeches were brief and carefully worded, acknowledging both Ralph's criminal past and his decades of legal life without trying to make sense of the conflicts between them. The overall tone was one of complicated respect, recognition of a man who had made serious mistakes, but had spent most of his life trying to learn from them. Father Michael O'Brien, who had known Ralph during his final years and had given spiritual advice during his illness, gave the main speech. "Ralph Capone lived 3 lives," he said, echoing words from Ralph's own journals. The first brought him wealth and power through means that harmed others. The second brought him poverty and isolation as he tried to rebuild. The third brought him peace through acceptance of what he could not change and dedication to what he could control. The priest's words captured something essential about Ralph's journey: that redemption might not give back what was lost, but it could create something new and valuable. Ralph's later years had not returned him to his former status or erased his past mistakes, but they had shown that change was possible, and that even deeply flawed lives could find meaning through service to others. The burial took place on a cold November day that seemed right for marking the end of a life that had spanned from the horse and buggy era to the space age. Ralph had seen the change of America from a mostly rural society to an urban industrial power, and his own life had shown many of the opportunities and conflicts of that change. The simple gravestone that marked Ralph's final resting place gave only his name and the dates of his birth and death. There were no references to his criminal fame, no mentions of his business achievements, no symbols of power or wealth in death as in his final years. Ralph Capone had achieved the being unknown that had escaped him for most of his adult life. Being unknown did not mean being unimportant. The impact of Ralph's inventions in organized crime continued to affect law enforcement techniques and academic understanding of criminal enterprises. His example of attempted rehabilitation continued to inform discussions about criminal justice and return to society. His quiet service to his community during his legal years continued to affect people whose lives had been touched by his generosity. Perhaps most importantly, Ralph's story continued to serve as a warning about the tempting nature of criminal success and the lasting consequences of choices made in youth. His life showed that intelligence, ability, and ambition could create spectacular achievements, but that the methods used to achieve success ultimately decided its sustainability and meaning. The complete arc of Ralph's life, from immigrant child to criminal mastermind to struggling restaurateur to elderly man, showed themes that went beyond organized crime. His story spoke to universal questions about ambition and consequence, about the possibility of change and the difficulty of redemption, about the relationship between individual choices and social forces. In the end, Ralph Bottles Capone's legacy was not the empire he had built or the wealth he had collected, but the complexity of his human journey. He had been at the same time a criminal inventor and a devoted family man, an advanced business strategist, and a man who ultimately chose honest work over profitable crime, a figure of historical importance and a neighbor who quietly helped those in need. His story reminds us that human beings are capable of both great harm and genuine redemption, that the most important choices we make may not be those that bring immediate success, but those that define who we choose to become when success proves empty or not lasting. Ralph Capone lived long enough to understand both the costs of his criminal choices and the value of his efforts to rise above them. The quiet dignity of his final decades, not marked by wealth or power, but marked by service and honesty, perhaps represents the truest measure of his life's meaning. In choosing to serve pasta to working-class customers, rather than seeking to rebuild his criminal empire, in cooperating with historians, rather than making his past seem glorious, in accepting responsibility for his choices, while working to minimize their ongoing harm to others, Ralph showed that even the most compromised lives can find redemption through service and humility. His story ends not with dramatic flourishes or spectacular changes of fortune, but with the simple recognition that a life's value cannot be measured by its highest achievements alone, but must also consider its response to failure, its ability to grow, and its addition to the common good. Ralph Capone's addition may have been modest and mostly unrecognized, but it was genuine and lasting. And in a world that often celebrates power and wealth without questioning where they come from or whether they can last, perhaps Ralph's later example of finding meaning in modest, honest work and quiet service to others offers wisdom that extends far beyond the specific circumstances of his remarkable and tragic life. His story truly ends as it was lived in those final decades, quietly, with dignity, and with the understanding that the most important victories are often the most private ones, achieved not through control over others, but through mastery of oneself. What did you think of Ralph's story? Did it change how you see the Capone organization? Which part of his journey spoke to you the most? The business genius that built an empire? The tragic fall that destroyed everything he had worked for? Or the quiet dignity of his attempts to rebuild? If this deep dive into Ralph Capone's life helped you relax tonight, you will love our entire collection of gangster stories. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Until then, sleep well and remember, every empire has its unknown stories, and every legend casts shadows that hide the most human of dramas. Sometimes the most fascinating stories belong not to those who made the headlines, but to those who worked behind the scenes to build something extraordinary, only to watch it fall apart and spend the rest of their lives learning to live with the consequences of their choices. Good night.